thanks so much for being here.
Cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
So to start off our discussion, I would like to begin with where you first met Sunmu and if he was initially open to the idea of the film being made.
So thanks again, everyone, for coming. I feel very formal here in this chair. I don't know. Can I stand? Is that okay?
If you'd like to.
I don't know where the cord comes from.
There's room to stand.
So I met Sunmu through an organization which was mentioned earlier, Liberty in North Korea. For a long time, I've been working with them to create media, both as a photographer and as a filmmaker, for them to use in order to raise support for their organization. Liberty in North Korea helps North Koreans resettle by providing resources for them both in South Korea and in the United States. And I had traveled around China with them, visiting various shelters that they have. They basically have an underground railroad throughout China and Southeast Asia, where they help, before they even get to South Korea, they help kind of give resources to North Koreans that are trying to get out. So I had worked with them over the years on several projects, and in 2013, I was shooting a short video project for them, and they mentioned Sunmu, and they said, we'd like to take you to his studio and show you his work. So I visited his studio in Seoul and saw his beautiful paintings and was really moved by them. And they had told me, they said, you know, Sunmu is very hesitant about having people photograph him or film him, but we think it could be really interesting if you made a feature film about him. And at the time, I was in the middle of working on another documentary. And what I didn't realize at the time was they had actually already pitched me to him as a director. And they said, we think this filmmaker could make a movie about you and you should totally do it. And he had already said no. So we went out to dinner, and there's, of course, a language barrier, and my translator was like, oh, by the way, he has already said no, so now it's your job to convince him. So we proceeded to eat Korean food and drink soju like you do in Seoul, and just got to know each other. And partly through just getting to hang out with Sunmu and spend more time with him, and also through the relationship that I had with Liberty in North Korea, because he really trusted them. They had been working with him for a long time in his own resettlement. Over time, actually over a relatively short amount of time, he grew to trust me. And I said one night over drinks, I said, okay, well, will you let me make a movie about you? And he said, where's your camera? So that was in 2013. And then it was about a year later that I found the hook to pin the story to, which was the exhibit in Beijing. Which this exhibit in Beijing was very historical in and of itself. As far as I know, and if anyone in here can correct me, please do, no other North Korean has had a solo exhibit in Beijing that was not sanctioned by the North Korean government. So going into this exhibit, we already knew that it was going to be a relatively historic moment for a North Korean. Before you ask another question, I'm just curious, just so I can gauge my room here, how many people in this room would consider themselves to be experts on the Korean Peninsula? Do I have anyone? I'm looking for journalists and professors, people that are smarter than me. Okay, how many people knew a little bit about the Korean Peninsula going into this movie? So a good chunk of you. Okay, good to know. It just helps me. And please, I'm a filmmaker. My way into North Korea and to understanding North Korea is Sunmu and his own story. I did not get my PhD in policy. So this can be a conversation. If there's anybody that wants to chime in, please feel free.
I just wanted to follow up on what you just said about the exhibit, and I was wondering if you were concerned about potentially footage being confiscated while you were shooting outside the exhibit and also inside the gallery, and what kind of precautions did you have to take about that?
I'll probably say a few more things about this as we get to open up the discussion, but the the precautions that were made leading up to the exhibit were a little bit haphazard by all parties, or haphazardly thrown together. Mr. Liang, the curator from the art museum, had told me in the months leading up to the exhibit, he said it's a good chance, within 24 to 48 hours that the Chinese, authorities are going to come and say, okay, like we have to shut this down. So it was always kind of known that this was not going to be an exhibit that lasted very long. But even in the months prior, Mr. Liang and everyone else had been sort of, kind of wishy-washy about it. They were just like, well, we know the people that come in, and we know the Chinese minders that monitor the shows that we do, and they're pretty reasonable. We don't think there's going to be much problem. They did want to advertise it, only in certain forums and not make a big public announcement about it. But nobody really anticipated the way things would end up happening, and least of all Sun Mu and his family, and myself and my crew. So when around 3 o'clock the police started showing up, initially just a few, and then 40 or 50 police cars, it became very clear that things were a lot more serious than we thought, and we had to kind of scramble to make do and be as safe as we could. So I can probably answer more about that in a few moments, but.
I just have one more question I wanted to ask before we open it up to audience questions, because I know we did start late and I want everyone to have their questions heard. But I wanted to ask about the animated sequences in the film, because they complement Sun Mu's stories really beautifully and also showcase his work. And I was wondering at what stage you decided to incorporate animation into the film and what that part of the production process was like.
Well, very early on, I had the idea of using animation to bring his paintings to life. And when we first started initial photography for the film, I asked Sun Mu, would you be open to letting us bring an animator on to kind of work with your paintings to help tell your story? And he was excited about it, actually. It was really important to myself and my amazing animator, Ryan Wayner, to make sure that although we were manipulating Sun Mu's paintings, that we were staying true to their essence. And so we worked really closely with Sun Mu. Ryan was pretty meticulous. I pushed him probably even further than he would have wanted to about not changing the nature of the painting. And every time we created a new animation sequence, we'd send it to Sun Mu and get his approval. On top of which, my animator actually flew to Seoul and worked with Sun Mu to create the plates for a lot of the animation that you saw there. So if it was sketches, those were all inspired by actual sketches from his sketchbook that we had him recreate for us. So all of those, kind of the backstory on the white paper, was all stuff that Sun Mu drew, frame by frame. And even the sort of the paint going across the canvas was paint from Sun Mu's studio. So.
Well, I'd like to open it up to audience questions at this point. If anybody had a question, just raise your hand. Yep.
Hi, Adam. Thanks, really enjoyed that. Just have a quick question. I was just wondering, in the process of, in the process of making the film, or just interacting with Sun Mu, did your opinions about North Korea change at all from where you started? I mean, it's interesting that you said you're not an expert on the subject. How do your opinions change? And I guess also, if you have any change in your opinions about China as well as South Korea, that would be interesting here as well.
It's a good question. Going into this project, I had been working on the issue a bit, and Liberty North Korea, one of their big, as an organization who I had worked for, one of their big goals is changing the narrative around North Korea, is refocusing it away from the Kims and the regime and putting it back on the people. Not, kind of steering away from the personality cult and the Dennis Rodman kind of news headline stories that we normally see, and help people really understand it on a human level, which I appreciate, and that's something I really care about as a filmmaker whenever I'm working on a project. The documentary I worked on before this was about breakdancing in post-conflict zones. So that film was all about trying to kind of see a different side of, when you go into a slum in Uganda, try to see a different side of that place. I went to Yemen for that project and filmed Breakdancers in Yemen right around the time of the Arab Spring. So I really was interested in Sun Mu as a person because, he talks about his divided heart. And I think, and he creates images that are offensive to South Koreans as well. And to, I think if you're thoughtful, to anyone really. I mean, he's creating images both of hope, but also images that are supposed to make you feel conflicted. He has a painting that you might have seen a flash of on there with Kim Jong-un and the president of South Korea holding hands. And I asked my translator, who's South Korean, what do you think of that painting? And he said, well, I don't really know how to feel about that painting. As a South Korean. And I love that about Sun Mu, because even though he does satirize the Kims and the regime, he also paints a lot of paintings of children and these iconic images of hope. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but I feel like Sun Mu just sort of helped solidify this idea for me that the change is going to happen on the peninsula. Not trying to seem too idealistic about what the future is. There's a lot to overcome, but change is going to happen by people thinking differently about this issue and not towing the party line, because clearly that hasn't been working for 60 plus years. So.
Thank you so much for the film. This is a question. I'm just curious that when you use North Korean images, like from regime side, on your film, how's the copyright or issues works? And that was my first question.
Good question.
And the second question, what was it? The second question is that you shot still in that conflict with the police and from outside. And is there such a thing like, like in the States, there's a public space you can still shoot, right, without the consent? And how that works in China? So that's the question.
Oh wow, that's a good question. I'm probably not going to give you a very satisfying answer to that, because on some of it is public. Some of the footage we've used is public domain. Some of it is stuff we'll never get permission to use by the DPRK, and then some of it is stuff we're still in the process of getting licensing and permission for. So you were some of the very first people to have seen this film. We have a whole another 6 to 9 months of festivals and touring, and we haven't even come close to securing distribution for it. So all of what you're talking about is what we have lawyers working on now. But interestingly enough, there is some footage that we want to use in the film, and we won't ever likely get permission, because it's directly from the DPRK, especially that footage at the very end, which is some of the first HD footage to come out. So good question. And I hope that I've always felt a little bit conflicted, because there's these, and most of us have probably seen these videos, whether on YouTube or on the news, of children musicians that are playing these instruments, and they're so unbelievably talented, but the conditions under which they've been taught and brought up to be as talented as they are, I've felt a little strange even using it in the film without being able to give them credit where credit is due. So I hope to be able to do that, but it's tough.
We had another question over here. Yeah. We can take another after that if there's anybody waiting.
Hi, I really enjoyed the film.
Thank you.
And I was curious because you chose to shoot Sun Mu's wife and not cover her face or anything. So I was curious about that. How is that, if that's not a threat or a dangerous possibility for her? And also I was curious about if you worked with animation before, or if you have worked with the animators before in that whole process of making it. And I was also very curious the question you had, but you've answered it already, so thank you.
The question you have is a very good question, and it's the very short answer to Sun Mu's security is that he always requests that no one show his face, and he has not had his face photographed or it has not been seen in public. He always wears a mask when he goes to exhibits. But I had a journalist point out, well, you can see his wife. Clearly, everyone that's standing around knows who he is. And so is this just a gimmick in the film? And I promise you it's not a gimmick. He's very militant about not showing his own face, but somewhere along the line, his children became publicly known. I don't know when he started painting them. The best thing that I can tell you is that his wife and kids are South Korean. His concern is his family back home that he left over a decade ago. And as far as we know, the North Koreans do not know who Sun Mu, the painter, was back in North Korea. So he doesn't show his face because someone back home might recognize him. But he can show his face to people he trusts in South Korea. Now, has he crossed the line many times about what was safe? Yes, absolutely. Are we continually, kind of pushing him to be more careful? Absolutely. He wore a mask we had the premiere of the film in South Korea. He wore a mask. Even still, I was like, Sun Mu, are you sure this is okay? But, we're going to continue to work with him as the film comes out to make sure that he takes every precaution he can. We have an organization from the States that is an expert in helping provide security to people like Sun Mu. So we're hoping to continue to help him with that. But it's a very good question. And
How did North Korea not know who he is if he was discovered in the military?
well, so Sun Mu served for 7 years in the military, 7 or 8 years in the military, and there are many propaganda artists that serve in the military. So he's one of many people. He left the military, he was hungry, and he left. And there are numerous North Koreans that have left the country. So it is very difficult for the DPRK to keep track of who has come and gone. And as far as we know, they have not figured out who Sun Mu, the painter, was when he was back in South Korea. Does that make sense? I know it's a little strange. Yeah.
Yeah, we have time for one last question.
As a filmmaker, what are risks that you're willing to take? Because as you become more well-known, this screens around the world. I mean, there's limitations to where you're going to be able to travel in the future because you're exposing a lot of very, very serious stuff. And so while you want to show what's going on in the world in its rawness, what risks are you willing to take to block your life from being able, because China might not let you back in, for example, etc. So how do you make those decisions about what you're willing to do and how much risk you're willing to put yourself in?
It's interesting this exhibit got shut down in July of last year, so a little over a year ago. And we left 2 days after the exhibit got shut down. Within hours, Sun Mu was out. He has a different name on his passport, so he left immediately. The Chinese artist who helped host him also immediately left and didn't come back. Just basically stayed in South Korea because the Chinese government was looking for him because they believed that he was aiding and abetting North Korean defectors. Mr. Liang is still in Beijing. He was under strict supervision, was not able to leave the city limits for about 9 months. Finally was able to leave. His phone is still being monitored. Sun Mu's paintings still haven't been retrieved. So I don't know. I just think about them because I have this U.S. passport that is the most humbling thing to own because it's saved me from so many situations all over the world, and I don't, Americans get a bad reputation for being overly patriotic. I don't feel overly patriotic about it. I just feel very grateful for it because even when my translator was detained for hours and questioned the day the exhibit got shut down, nobody stopped me. I don't know where the boundaries always are, and that gets me into trouble. I've been arrested in the Sinai, for trying to film breakdancers in Gaza. Usually I just tell the truth, and it's absurd enough that they believe me, and then they let me go. But Yeah, I don't know. Someday maybe I'll find out what that limit is. Hopefully not. Any other questions?
We can take one more.
Hello. Right. With his artwork, because it seemed like he had sort of his practical training back from got in North Korea. Like if you look at his paintings, it's got really strong elements of propaganda art. Did you ever have a conversation with him if did he use that style to make the artwork kind of more satirical, or when you have had a look around his studio and his sketches, is that sort of how he naturally draws or paints? If it's a sort of conscious decision to paint in a certain way, or if it just comes natural to him to paint that way?
So he grew up with more of a learning first more of the kind of classical style of drawing and painting, and then when he was in the military, began doing the propaganda work for the regime. When he went to Hongik University in South Korea, which is one of the most prestigious art schools in South Korea, his professors really were pushing him towards the more traditional art forms of painting. He was doing portraiture and landscapes, and he was lucky enough to have a few young professors who, basically said, "Why, what is this bullshit?" is what they told me. And they said, you should push yourself and you should paint what you know. And so he started, exploring this kind of repurposing these old images that he was so familiar with, and it was really popular. And it was popular, and it was also hated because he was painting pictures of the Kims, which in South Korea is illegal. So he would hang a picture of Kim Il-sung, and it was a pink picture. It was pink, and it had a Kim Il-sung with a lovely smile on his face, and then the flowers sort of said no, but that was really all that was. That was his big and so I think people were confused by it, which I think is so fascinating, because to him, he was, his hands were shaking when he was painting that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that answered you. Yeah.
Because I was interested if he, sometimes, as you say, in art schools, they kind of want you to do the fine art bullshit.
He had like the older professors, and then these younger professors who are really his peers now. They're other fellow artists that work, that have work that they show in galleries in South Korea. Those were the ones that really pushed him to push the boundaries a little bit and be a little more interesting. And now, on the other end of that, when they're all out drinking and hanging out, they say, make sure that you don't get too political, that people use you as a pawn in their political game. They're there to kind of, help him go between the two, because he risks being, seen as interesting because he's political, as opposed to pushing his own art form forward. So.
Well, I would like to close our discussion by asking if, with the wider release of the film now beginning, if you anticipate that there will be a push for Sun Mu's work to be released from the storage in Beijing, and if you've had any indication that there might be some pressure put on the Chinese government or to assist the gallery in having those released and made visible.
So the status of the paintings, as of the last I've heard, which was recently, the Chinese government has released the paintings. They're now at Mr. Zhang studio. He's the Chinese artist that helped Sun Mu prepare for the show. The problem now is getting them out of China, so they've been released to Sun Mu officially. And Sun Mu, when I was in his studio about a month ago, and he had all of these shipping tubes so that in China they could take all of the canvases off the frames, roll them up, and put them in the shipping tubes and send them off. It's just, the concern is, will they make it out of China? I think he's just been hesitant on the timing of that, and so as of right now, as far as I understand, they're still there, but we're hopeful. That was his livelihood for the next year and a half, so luckily Liberty in North Korea has been really great in supporting, coming alongside him and helping him sell more of his other paintings, but that was an enormous body of work that is still just stuck in limbo, so hopefully soon.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us tonight and telling us more about the making of the film. If anybody is interested in arranging a screening or wants to learn more about the film, where would be the best place for them to look?
Right now we have just a small splash page up on iamsunmoo.com, so that we're trying to keep it up to date with when there are screenings. But other than that, you can just keep looking for some information about I Am Sun Moo. Type it into Google and it should come up.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and bearing with us through our tech glitches. I'm glad that we didn't work out. And thank you very much.